Let's move then from culture and society to talking about doctrine. In many respects, we have now come to essentially 2 centuries after the Reformation. There isn't much to talk about. I mean, there's a lot of things we're going to talk about. But as far as the doctrinal variety and flowering, like we see in the Reformation period and even into the 16th century, by the 18th century has largely quieted down. There isn't that much doctrinal innovation or development. A lot of it is the status quo. It's almost as if people are focusing so much on some of these political events that there isn't the time as much to reflect on some of these things. Now, certainly, maybe we could have put deism in doctrine as opposed to culture and society, and so some of those things could overlap. But there are some very important doctrinal developments in the 18th century that we do want to talk about. One of those is the idea of natural theology. Now, natural theology essentially is the idea that God's existence is evident in nature. Now, this idea has been around for centuries in Christianity, and even within Greek philosophy way back. There were ideas of how nature could reveal things about God, or the gods. Right? Certainly not a Christian concept, but this idea of nature revealing God's existence was something that was around. But within Christianity, it's the 18th and even into the 19th century that you really see a strong development of theological reflection on nature to try and talk about God's existence. Essentially, the argument of the natural theologians is that God's existence could be determined from nature and not just from revelation. Now, some of this, of course, is the rise of science and how science is questioning some traditionally held beliefs. And how, as we see through the Enlightenment, there are a lot of thinkers that are starting to reject revelation as being something reasonable. Essentially, the idea behind natural theology is that God had 2 books. The book of Revelation, or Scripture, the Bible, and the book of nature. One of the major natural theologians of the late 18th and into the 19th century was a man named William Paley. Paley was born in England in the 1740s and eventually becomes a lecturer at Christ College at Cambridge. And a lot of his lecturing was on moral philosophers, people like Locke and some of the other people we've talked about. Eventually he's ordained as an Anglican priest in the 1760s and begins writing a variety of textbooks on philosophy. There are a couple of areas where Paley is important for later Christians. First is his kind of natural theological argument that has some precedence in other cases, but this is the way it really becomes formulated and gets spread. Paley essentially compares life or the universe to a watch found in the forest. Coming upon such an object, right, finding a watch in the forest, we would assume that there is a watchmaker behind it, right? There's something about the design, the intricacy, the detail that could not have just naturally occurred in this forest. Now, certainly, since Darwin and others, there have been a lot of non-Christians who have attacked this thesis and developed arguments in response to it. But Paley is the one who really kind of promotes this argument and really catches on, especially with a lot of English Protestants, even into the United States. Sometimes referred to as the teleological argument, or the argument from design. The universe exhibits design, so there must be a designer. Paley also spends some time writing about Christian evidences additionally, right? Not just that we can know God exists from nature, but that Christianity is the religion God wants us to follow. There were essentially two arguments that Paley had about the truthfulness of Christianity. First had to do with the suffering of the apostles. Paley's argument, and one that still has some support today, is that the apostles would not have gone through the hardships that they did, even to the point of martyrdom, if they had invented Jesus' teaching, and even the resurrection. And so he believed that that was evidence for the truthfulness of Christianity. These people went through those experiences. They wouldn't have done it for a lie, at least according to Paley. The second thing that also Paley argued was that the miracle stories in the New Testament, predominantly Jesus' miracles, were much better attested than miracle stories in other religions. And so in a society that is becoming more and more negative toward the supernatural, toward stories of the supernatural breaking in, these stories of miracles in times past, Paley tried to say the miracles of the New Testament were on a different level than the miracle stories, let's say, in Hinduism or maybe in some other religions and traditions. Because, he said, there was better attestation. People were eyewitnesses to these things and the records of these eyewitnesses. Now, certainly, these arguments didn't become really persuasive for people who were already against Christianity. For a lot of Christians, it helped them confirm their faith, as a lot of apologetics do. There's very little work done in apologetics that is convincing to outsiders. Sometimes it does happen. But most of the time, apologetics or evidences usually serves to help the faithful remain faithful. Questions about natural theology? Anything we need to emphasize or clarify with respect to that? In the 18th century, as far as Christian theologians go, perhaps it is Jonathan Edwards that stands head and shoulders above everyone else. There are not a lot of strict theologians in the 18th century, but Jonathan Edwards is probably the premier one. In fact, there are some people that identify Jonathan Edwards as America's greatest theologian. Of course, considering a lot of the theology that comes out of the United States, not elsewhere, some people would say that's not that great of a title. There's not much to compare it to. A lot of theology is usually done in Europe and in other places. In the United States, it's been more about practical matters. It's been more focused on, kind of a lived-out theology and not a reflective theology. Edwards was born in 1703 in Connecticut to a minister and his wife. His grandfather as well was a minister, so he's been in a ministerial family. His son, at least one of his sons, will become a minister as well. And so from an early age, his family prepared him to be a minister. It was almost like there was no other path for him to take. His father, as he was growing up, ran a preparatory school for boys who weren't quite ready for college to help them prepare for college. And so early in his life, Edwards was learning classical and biblical languages. He was learning Latin and Hebrew and Greek. He was learning philosophy, science, and church history. At the age of 13, Edwards would enter what would later become Yale College. At the time, it wasn't Yale, it wasn't named Yale, but he entered college, which was around customary. 4 years later, he graduates as valedictorian and begins graduate studies to be a minister. At the time, you needed to have a master's degree in order to be a minister. While he's studying to become a minister, he's also reading philosophical works. John Locke, very important for him. He's also reading scientific works like those of Isaac Newton. While a student, he starts ministering for a Presbyterian church in New York City. So he's taking classes at what will become Yale, as well as preaching. Most of his sermons at the time were, as one scholar describes them, warm, earnest, and optimistic, emphasizing the beauty of God and the godly life. Edwards would finish his degree in 1723. Right, so he's 20 years old and now preaching. He preaches for a variety of places over the next several years, while also working as a tutor at Yale College, but eventually moves to Massachusetts to help his grandfather, who is aging, and he's kind of helping out as a co-minister. Right? His grandfather is still health-wise not able to do everything, and so Edwards goes to help him with some of those things. Edwards was very Calvinistic and ultimately concerned that a lot of the theology in New England was very liberal. Now, what that means in the scope of theology is that it's questioning things like, was Jesus God? And that's what we mean when we talk about liberal theology. Additionally, he felt that a lot of the theology in New England was becoming more Arminian, right? That people have the ability to affect God's decision about their salvation or not. And so a lot of his preaching in this Massachusetts congregation was focused on God's grace and the transformation that is needed to change that in a person's soul. In 1729, his grandfather dies, and so he steps into that position, becomes the full-time minister and the sole minister. In the middle of the 1730s, his congregation begins experiencing a great revival. A lot of people are becoming very emotionally connected to Christianity. They're becoming more active in the church. And church numbers are growing. He publishes a description of what's going on in this congregation in a work titled A Faithful Narrative of the Surprising Work of God. Edwards becomes very well known internationally. The document, the treatise, circulates not just in Massachusetts, but throughout the colonies and eventually overseas. People begin looking to Edwards as a model for evangelism. Right? He's successful. There must be something there that would be useful in our local church. But in the late 1730s, he starts to experience a lot of tensions with the congregation he's ministering to. They built a new building and gave preferred seating to the wealthy people in the town. A practice that Edwards doesn't approve of and made it known quite vocally. Furthermore, by the end part of the 1730s, a lot of those people that had converted in the middle of the decade didn't seem to be evidencing godly behavior in their lives. It didn't seem to have much concern for religion now that they are 3, 4, 5 years out of their conversion. And so he becomes convinced that the conversions of the middle of the 1730s were false. And so he tries a variety of options to try and bring back that revival. How do we get this started again? Maybe this will help those people that have failed to change, convert, and transition. When a minister named George Whitefield, who we'll talk about on Wednesday, arrives in the 1740s, the congregation experiences again this emotional revival. So there's a lot of people emotionally connected and moved in the services, people attending, conversions. And Edwards tries to feed off of this fervor and preaches his most famous sermon, Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God. The sermon becomes well known and has been reprinted in anthologies of colonial writings for centuries. But when Edwards first preaches the sermon to his church, the church doesn't really respond that much to it. It's kind of like, okay, we've heard this before. When he preaches it in a nearby town, however, the people are moaning and shrieking and weeping as he preaches it. They're crying out for salvation. They're crying out because they fear they are going to hell. And so in this nearby town, there is this sudden emotional response. Here are a couple of parts of the sermon. I'm not going to read the whole thing, obviously. But here's some of the things Edwards tells his audience. There's the dreadful pit, right? He wants them to see. Right? There's the dreadful pit of hell, of the glowing flames of the wrath of God. There is hell's wide, gaping mouth open, and you have nothing to stand upon, nor anything to take hold of. There is nothing between you and hell but the air. It is only the power and mere pleasure of God that holds you up. Your wickedness makes you, as it were, heavy as lead, and to tend downwards with great weight and pressure towards hell. If God should let you go, you would immediately sink and swiftly descend and plunge into the bottomless gulf. And your healthy constitution and your own care and prudence, best contrivance, and all your righteousness would have no more influence to uphold you and keep you out of hell than a spider's web would have to stop a falling rock. Were it not for the sovereign pleasure of God, the earth would not bear you one moment, for you are a burden to it. The creation groans with you. The creature is made subject to the bondage of your corruption, not willingly. The sun does not willingly shine upon you to give you light to serve sin and Satan. And the world would spew you out were it not for the sovereign hand of him who has subjected it in hope. There are the black clouds of God's wrath now hanging directly over your heads, full of the dreadful storm and big with thunder. And were it not for the restraining hand of God, it would immediately burst forth upon you. The sovereign pleasure of God for the present stays his rough wind. Otherwise it would come with fury, and your destruction would come like a whirlwind, and you would be like the chaff on the summer threshing floor. The God that holds you up over the pit of hell, much as one holds a spider or loathsome insect over the fire, abhors you and is dreadfully provoked. His wrath towards you burns like fire. He looks upon you as worthy of nothing else but to be cast into the fire. He has a purer eyes than to bear to have you in his sight. You are 10,000 times more abominable in his eyes than the most hateful, venomous serpent is in ours. You have offended him infinitely more than ever a stubborn rebel did his prince, and yet it is nothing but his hand that holds you from falling into the fire every moment. It is to be ascribed to nothing else that you did not go to hell the last night, that you were suffered to awake again in this world after you closed your eyes to sleep, and there is no other reason to be given why you have not dropped into hell since you arose in the morning, but that God's hand has held you up. There is no other reason to be given why you have not gone to hell since you have sat here in the house of God, provoking his pure eyes by your sinful, wicked manner of attending his solemn worship. Yea, there is nothing else that is to be given as a reason why you do not this very moment drop down into hell. But the response that Edwards receives at this nearby church, as you can kind of probably picture people weeping and wailing over what he says their condition is like, Edwards continues to write and to preach in support of these revivals that are taking place. Largely because a lot of people become opposed to the revivals because of the emotionalism that is spreading throughout the colonies, especially in New England. And so in response, he writes in 1746 a document called Treatise Concerning Religious Affections. This document about religious emotions, which he starts off with the statement that true religion, in great part, consists in holy affections. Now, he says affections, but he's talking about emotions. So even though Edwards is known for his theology, he also wanted his audience to understand that if you're truly religious, your emotions are going to be involved as well. But notice he says they're holy affections. So there's a difference in Edwards' mind between holy emotions and non-holy emotions. And so in his treatise, he tries to set out for people some characteristics by which they can look at their lives and say, is what I'm experiencing a holy emotion, or is it something else? So there are a couple of things, he says, that don't necessarily prove that an emotion is holy. Just because it is a raised emotion, right? There's a very intense feeling, would be another way to think about it. That in itself doesn't mean that we're talking about a religious emotion or a religious affection. Right? You could have a really intense feeling for something that's not specifically religious. Another thing that is not a sign is that there is an emotional impact on the body. Right? You know, that you're beginning to sweat or your hands are shaking because of this emotional experience. That in itself doesn't say that this is a religious affection. And so you shouldn't be using these kind of things to judge them as religious. And then finally, the characteristics we'll talk about here. Just because it has the appearance of love doesn't mean that it is a religious affection.